The age-old question that we all want answered is what happens when we die. After all, we are going to experience death at some point or another. Does the soul exit the body and pass through into a tunnel of light? Are deceased family members there to greet us on the other side? What happens to those that do not pass into the light? Do they linger here in this earthly realm as what we call ghosts until someone helps them cross over? Does time no longer exist on the other side, and what is the nature of consciousness? Is consciousness something that happens only in the brain, or does consciousness exist independent of it? Is there evidence for reincarnation, where young children remember things from past lives and sometimes also bear marks or other physical traits from a past life? Do people really have near-death experiences, and if so, what are some of the common traits of those who have claimed to have journeyed beyond? Some have said that there is no judgment on the other side, only universal love and a life review to help our souls learn and progress. Join me and Stephen Hawley Martin, best-selling author of Afterlife, The Whole Truth, as we explore these unexplainable phenomena and more. Greetings and welcome once again to Passion for the Paranormal, bringing a passion for the paranormal to you. I'm your host, Curry Stegan, and so wonderful to be back with you once again. And it's going to be another great episode. I've got none other than Stephen Hawley Martin joining me. Stephen is author of the book Afterlife, The Whole Truth. He is a best-selling author, and he covers so many different concepts in his book that revolve around the idea of the afterlife and what happens when we die, what the nature of consciousness is, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, reincarnation, remote viewing, and so much more. So great to have him on the show, and so excited to have this discussion with him about his book and his research. And the other thing I wanted to mention is, and I've mentioned this before, while it is free to consume and listen to all past episodes of Passion for the Paranormal, and we are on pretty much all the podcast apps out there, Stitcher, Apple, Google Play, Podcoin, and a few others out there as well. It is not free to produce the show. So as such, I have set up a new Patreon page, and if you want to become a patron of the show and donate to it, feel free to do so, and that's going to help us further offset the costs of running the show. There's hidden costs that listeners do not see, paying, a podcasting service, hosting service like SoundCloud in this case, to host the show, and paying for other things like paying for running the website and other various expenses and buying equipment and that sort of thing. And we do advertising, and the small bit of advertising that you hear on the show does not offset the cost of running the show. So if you want to become a patron and support the show, please do so. There's a link on the Facebook page at facebook.com/passion, the number 4, the paranormal. And you can access the link there. I'm also going to put a link up on the website, so you can go there and access it and find ways to go in and donate to the show. Now, the other thing that I'm going to do here is look out for some Passion for the Paranormal swag and special offers for people who donate certain amounts as a patron. So look out for some of that down the road here. Hopefully I'll be getting that out or putting that out here pretty soon as time permits. Also, we are an Amazon affiliate, and what that means is you'll see links to products from past guests, primarily books, and a few other products, whether it's documentaries, that sort of thing. You can go on to the website and click on that link, and if you want to buy a book from a past guest, please access it there. A little bit of the proceed will go to supporting the show as well. So just little ways that you can support the show. And if you visit the website, you can go on there and do some cool things like catch up with past episodes. And I already mentioned that you can purchase books. Click on a link right there on the website to purchase a book from a past guest. But the other thing that I wanted to mention is from the start, I've always wanted to make this podcast interactive and make listeners a part of the show. And as such, if you have a paranormal experience you'd like to share, please do so and go to the website, click on that Share Your Paranormal Experience. And that can be a UFO experience, a ghostly encounter you had, a haunted house that you lived in. Maybe you had what you think was a Bigfoot sighting. or any other strange, unusual experience that you had that may fall within that paranormal realm, feel free to share it on the website. You can also email me at passion, the number 4, the paranormal at gmail.com. And you can share your experience with me there as well. And just understand that, the whole idea here is, again, make the show interactive. And I'd like to dedicate an episode when I get enough people sharing their stories to talking about these experiences. And I'm also going to share a few of my own when I get enough people to participate. So please feel free to do that if you are willing to. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is I always talk about reviews, and I know maybe some of you get tired of hearing that, but one of the important things about reviews is it really proofs the show. And I had a couple of recent reviews done this month on the show, and I wanted to go ahead and read those reviews. And the thing that I want you to take away here is that one, if you provide a review, other people see that, and again, it helps them to see that there's some benefit, that people enjoy watching the show and tuning in. So I'll share a recent review done by Stacy Sue too, and she wrote, "You will enjoy this. Great show. Curry is an engaging host, knowledgeable about the subject matter. Excited to have stumbled across this podcast, Passion for the Paranormal." So thank you so much for your review there, Stacy. And then PDS Quadruple 7 here writes, "Fascinating topics. Great podcast with fascinating topics. Curry does an excellent job interviewing his guests. I look forward to listening to more episodes." So thank you again for those 2 reviews. And if you have a review you'd like to provide, you're using the iTunes app, please go ahead and do so, and I'll read your review on one of the next episodes. So once again, thank you for those reviews, for the 2 that provided them. And I just wanted to also mention that please make sure you subscribe to the show on whatever podcast app you're using. You can do that on Google Play. You can do it, I believe, on Stitcher, and certainly on Apple. Make sure you subscribe, rate, and review the show. And again, that's going to help us to keep moving this show forward. We've had some great growth over the last few months, and I want to continue that momentum. And so please do so. And the other thing I want to mention is I heard this fairly recently, that over 70% of advertising is done through word of mouth. So please make sure you share a link with tell a friend about the show, or family member if you think they'd like tuning in. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get into the discussion with Stephen Hawley Martin. I really hope you enjoyed tonight's show. And hey, thank you so much for tuning in. Okay, so my guest tonight is a best-selling author of several books, including his most recent book, Afterlife, The Whole Truth. And this is a compilation of Life After Death books 1 and 2. Half a dozen of his books have reached bestseller status on Amazon, and he is the only 3-time winner of the Writer's Digest Book Award. For 2 years, he hosted a successful internet radio talk show called The Truth About Life. He was a former advertising agency president and CEO, and he is currently editor and publisher of the Oak Leaf Press. It is my pleasure to welcome to the show Stephen Hawley Martin. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me on the show tonight.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
It's exciting to have you on the show. I read a good part of the first book, really most of the first book. A lot of great concepts you talked about in there, anywhere from the notion of consciousness and past life regressions, ESP, near-death experiences, remote viewing. So many different concepts covered in there, and some of this stuff I've covered on previous shows. But before we get into discussion about the book and some of these concepts, if you could kind of take us back to how you got started writing about this and talking about the reality of life and afterlife.
Well, I'll be happy to. I guess, I was raised in a family of what you would call secular humanists. They bought into the idea that if you couldn't see it under a microscope or some way measure it, that it didn't exist. And so I bought into that all the way through college and into into my working life. But one night I had what you might call an out-of-body experience. I don't know if it was near death or what. I had a bad case of the flu, and I just sort of somehow spun out of my body, and I felt like I was on the ceiling looking down at myself, and I just thought, oh my gosh, how is that possible? If my brain is creating my consciousness, how can I be outside of my body looking down at it? I should be inside my brain. And, that kind of opened my eyes to the idea that maybe the idea that the material world was all there is was maybe not right. And then at some point along the line, not far after that, I got a hold of the book written by David Moody, Life After Life. And I read that. It was a study that was done by Dr. David Moody. He was at the University of Virginia Medical School at that time, and I guess he was an intern there at the medical center, and he started interviewing people that had been clinically dead, heart stopped or whatever, and then brought back, and about their experience with that. And that was the first book that I know of about near-death experiences. There were about 150 that he investigated, and I just found it fascinating. I started reading that book, and I read it from cover to cover in one sitting. And so I then became very interested in metaphysics and all of that. I joined the Rosicrucian Society, which is a kind of a mystical society that really has teachings about metaphysics, and they say their history goes back to Egypt. I don't know if that's true, but there were people like Benjamin Franklin, who was a Rosicrucian, and other people that believed in reincarnation and so forth, which of course Benjamin Franklin did. And I just was interested in it. Also, I'm a writer, and I've always, that's what I have made my living. And back in 2007, I guess it was, I started the radio show you mentioned in when you were talking about me. And for 2 years, I interviewed people about this kind of thing, about psychic phenomena, about near-death experiences. I interviewed a couple of quantum physicists about their ideas of, how the mind and the universe relate, the double slit experiment, all those kinds of things. And so over that course of that couple of years, I interviewed over 100 people who really were into all of this, and that's when I started writing books about it. And this particular book, Afterlife, The Real Whole Truth, is two books, as you mentioned. The first one being Life After Death, Powerful Evidence You Will Never Die, and that's the title of that single volume. And then the second one is Heaven, Hell, and You, which kind of, the first part, I mean to be sort of addressing this subject in the most scientific way that I can, and the second part of it is kind of the second book is more my take on what it means and what we ought to do about it. So there you have it.
Interesting. Now, when you had your out-of-body experience, time-wise, did it seem like a long period of time, or was this a fairly short event? Do you recall kind of time?
It was a fairly short event. I mean, I lay down in my bed. I kind of felt like I was spinning, and then all of a sudden I was looking down at myself. I think I felt like I was bumping up against the ceiling, looking down at myself, and then that may have lasted 30 seconds, maybe a minute, probably not even a minute, and then I was back in my body, and I woke up the next morning. So it was very quick. I didn't go through a tunnel or see the light or have a past life review or anything like that. And that, of course, happens to a lot of people.
One of the other things,
I think maybe just my blood pressure dropped, and maybe my heart stopped for a minute or for a bit, but then I, came back.
Now, this happened at a fairly young age, right? I think you said in the book at about 27, where you were about 27.
Yeah, that's right. I was about 27 at the time. That's correct.
And I want to ask this because I know you covered in the book. Now, you lost your father at a fairly young age. Now, did you actually ever have any other experiences after that one that you would consider out of body, or any strange or out of ordinary experiences after that?
I think the one that immediately comes to mind is I had my first wife was French. She was a French girl that came to the States as an au pair, and I met her, and we dated for a year, and then we got married, and we got married here, but she wanted to get married in France as well. She came from a big family, and so we went over there, and her best friend was engaged to a guy named Philippe Sirot. Philippe was the commandant of the Calypso, the boat that Jacques Cousteau, if you remember him, ocean explorer kind of guy, who made a lot of films, and they were on PBS for a number of years back in the 70s, I guess. And Philippe, being her friend, was the maid of honor, and then since I didn't have a friend there, Philippe became my sort of best man. In France, they don't really call it that, but that's the idea. Anyway, we became good friends, and I went back and forth to France every summer. We would go there, and we would see them and visit them, and he became a pretty good friend. Well, Philippe committed suicide. The whole Jacques Cousteau thing ended, and he still had to make a living, and he became a captain of a boat that tended offshore oil rigs in the North Sea. And he and his girlfriend, my wife's best friend, had a falling out. And so he was depressed, I suppose, and ended up committing suicide. Well, he had an apartment in the at the ground level, the English basement level of my wife's girlfriend's house, where she lived with her mother. And it was still there, just as it was, and I'd visited it many times. Well, we went to visit the wife's girlfriend, and I left my wife with her friend talking, and my daughter, my 3-year-old daughter at that time, and I went down into Philippe's apartment in the basement because we were going to spend the night there. And my wife and I were going to sleep in his bed, and they'd set up a crib there for my daughter. And I just remember feeling an intense presence of Philippe there, that he was there. It was almost like he was leaning into my face. And the French have a different kind of personal space around them. They'll get a lot closer to you if they're friends with you than we Americans get to each other. And I just felt that. And he had told Joelle, his fiancée, that if he could, after his death, he would communicate with her if that was possible. And she apparently had some things happen, like a watch stopped during his funeral, things like that. And really felt that he was around there, and I did too. I mean, I just could feel this presence. Well, I got into the bed, put my daughter down first, and did the bedtime story or whatever, and put her down, and thought she was sleeping, and I crawled into the bed, and I had the light still on, and I was going to read a book, but I was just looking around and thinking, he is here. Well, all of a sudden, my daughter, 3 years old, sits up in the crib at the foot of my bed and says, "Daddy, don't think about ghosts. It doesn't do any good to think about ghosts." And I could tell you that every hair on my head was in the back of my neck was standing up. And I think that I've come to the conclusion that it was Philippe who was communicating to me through my daughter and my 3-year-old daughter. So that, I guess, is the best kind of story I have of a personal experience like you were talking about.
All right. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And getting back to, you talk about your father. He died when you were at a very young age, and I think you mentioned that there was kind of you had felt that he was really angry at you, and shortly before he had passed, and you kind of felt or you felt some guilt over the situation. Has there anything you've researched all this phenomena, psychic phenomena, and all that kind of stuff? Have you ever been able to reach any kind of? Do you feel like you've ever been able to reach any kind of closure after that? And do you feel a lot more at peace nowadays?
Well, yeah, for a long time I felt guilty. He died when I was 7 years old. He had a heart attack, and uh, he had had one heart attack, but back in those days, they didn't necessarily put you in the hospital. He was at home, supposed to be on bed rest, but he actually got up and went downstairs, and I saw him there, and he got angry with me about something, I don't know, I'd drawn on the wall. I was 7 years old, and then that was the last time I saw him alive, and so that just stayed with me. But I guess what kind of gave me closure about it was when I interviewed Julie Beischel. Julie is a PhD in pharmacology who lost her mother to suicide and also felt very guilty about it and wanted to see if she could somehow communicate with her mother. And she began doing these studies with psychics, and she's done a number of them. She's founded a nonprofit organization called the Windbridge Association to do this kind of psychic research, and has been able to do double-blind, triple-blind studies using the kind of methodology you would as a pharmaceutical scientist, to make sure that drugs work, so that, you've got placebos and you have the real drug and so forth, and people don't know which one they're getting. Well, she set up those kind of experiments with psychics and was able to demonstrate statistically that psychics are, in fact, able to not necessarily communicate with people who are dead, but at least get information that nobody else could have known other than those people that they're supposed to be communicating with. But then but that is not how she communicated with her mother. Her mother came to her in a dream and set her straight about, kind of relieved her guilt, so that, it wasn't because of her that she committed suicide and all that sort of thing. But that whole episode and talking with Julie kind of brought back my feelings about my father, and somehow it worked on me to release the guilt feeling. I don't think that I don't have a bit of guilt about it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Going to the studies she did, and I think you address this a little bit in the book. How do you deal with the skeptic's point of view that psychics are simply perhaps drawing off of, and I don't know if you want to call it telepathy, that sort of thing, which in itself could be kind of like a paranormal, type of experience in and of itself. But how do you?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, I was going to say, I mean, the explanations of what could be going on is the psychic could be reading the mind. That's not a scientific term, but reading the mind of the person who wants to talk to the dead person. Picking up on that thoughts. They could also, use trickery, and I'm sure there's plenty of charlatans out there who claim to be psychics who are nothing more than charlatans. But when Julie was doing this research, she set it up so that the psychic would not have contact with the relative. I mean, she had a third party kind of thing going on, so that she had all this double blind stuff set up. Now, that may have eliminated the idea or the possibility that they were psychics were reading the loved one's mind about the person. But the other kind of explanations might be that there's this psychic reservoir out there, I think they call it, where, in Edgar Cayce calls it the Akashic Records, where there's a kind of memory or a mind that surrounds the earth that contains everybody's memories and everything that's ever happened, and they could be tapping into that rather than the individual mind. But even so, with all that, if those couple of those kinds of explanations are true, it still says that that the materialistic worldview that your brain creates your awareness and consciousness and holds your memories, and it's all inside your head, that would argue that that's a false belief anyway, which I believe it is. I mean, there's overwhelming evidence, whether you accept that life after death or not, that is not the truth. That there is mind that is non-local, that is not inside your head. And in fact, I believe that what the University of Virginia has been saying in the research they're doing at the medical school in the Division of Perceptual Studies, that the brain is actually a receiver, like a cell phone, and your awareness, your consciousness is not in your brain. Your brain is picking up on your consciousness just like a radio receiver picks up on a radio signal that's coming from somewhere else. So anyway, that's my view on it.
So getting back to this idea of consciousness, and consciousness being kind of a universal thing, is it kind of this idea that consciousness is tied to the soul and not to our bodies?
Yeah, I think my belief after doing all this research and study and talking to so many people is that we have what in religion is called a soul. If you're not a religious type, it's something like a higher self or a personal consciousness that incarnates, and it comes and it does, the way you get from a non-physical realm where that higher self or soul exists to this earthly plane is through the mother's womb and through the fetus, through the birth canal, and that's how we get into this reality. And that we come here, the earth is really kind of like a school where we come here to experience and to learn, and we do it many, many times. I'm very interested, for example, in Edgar Cayce's, you may know, lived from 1877 to 1945. He was known back then as the sleeping prophet. He would go into a trance and people would ask him questions. Usually they were about health issues and, what I need to do to solve this health problem. But a lot of times the health problems had to do with past lives, something that happened previously, or certainly emotional problems that were brought over from past lives, karma and that sort of thing. And there are over something like 15,000, close to 15,000 readings that Edgar Cayce did over his lifetime that are recorded there in the library at Virginia Beach, the Division of Research and Enlightenment. And when you look at those, it all just seems to make sense that really is what's going on. Now, Edgar Cayce was a strong Christian, and when he learned that he was talking about reincarnation, he stopped doing those readings for a while because it really upset him. But then he read the Bible through and saw that there are a lot of references that, if you think about them, are talking about reincarnation, or at least indicating that reincarnation exists. So, Elijah came back as John the Baptist. John the Baptist is Elijah. Jesus said that. And that the blind man that he comes upon, and his disciples say, "Why was this man born blind? Was it he that sinned, or was it his parents?" And Jesus says, "No, it wasn't either of those things. It was because it was to show the will of God." Because then Jesus, of course, cures him of his blindness. But if he was born blind because of his sins, then he had to have had previous the things like that. And then Casey went on, was okay with reincarnation after that.
Interesting. It's fascinating how all these concepts you cover in the book really kind of tie in. But I want to get into the concept of past life regression. You cover a couple of cover a couple of at least 2 or 3 interesting stories about past life regression. One of them was about the young child who it appeared that he may have been a World War II pilot in a previous life. Can you talk a little bit more about that story? Because I think that's quite a fascinating one.
Well, that is an absolutely fascinating story. The child's name was James Leninger, I think. Yeah, James Leninger. And he was born to a Southern Baptist family in Louisiana, and hardly a pair that you would think would be interested in reincarnation, and they weren't. They didn't believe in it.
Right.
But James, when he was about 18 months, 2 years old, started noticing that he was having these terrible dreams at night, and he would scream, and it was like he was trying to get out of something, and he would say, plane on fire, or something. He would say these words, and they started asking him about it. And to make a kind of long story short, he recalled being an fighter pilot in World War II, and and he recalled people's names. He recalled the name of the ship that the aircraft carrier that he flew off of, the Nakoma. The Nakoma was the name of it. He recalled the names of some of his fellow pilots, a couple of whom were shot down as well, that he associated with in heaven, in the afterlife. He knew information that, a 2 or 3 year old child could not know. Those airplanes. One story is that he and his mother were in a toy store, and there was a World War II model airplane there, and it had these tanks on the wings, and the mom looked at it and said, "Oh, look, there are bombs on the wings there." And he said, "Oh, no, those aren't bombs. They're drop tanks, Mom. They're on there so the plane can fly farther, and when they run out, they drop the tanks off when they run out of gas, when the gas is out of." So, and things like that. So, and in fact, in 2000, I think he was born in 1999 or something like that. And in 2007, 2007, he went to a reunion of the people that were on that ship in the Tacoma, and he actually recognized them. He said, "Oh my gosh, they're so old," and he knew their names and so forth. So anyway, that is a fascinating case history of the young man who was the air fighter pilot in World War II. He was shot down at Iwo Jima, and there were people that his parents contacted that knew about, and in fact, a couple of other flyers that actually saw him shot down. His plane was hit in the nose by anti-aircraft fire, and did catch on fire and burned as it went down into the sea. And the other thing, here's a good one. The same boy said that he picked his parents. He said, I saw you staying at the Pink Hotel on the beach. And they recalled that when their child was conceived, they were on a vacation in Hawaii in the Pink Hotel on the beach. And he said he chose them because he thought they were nice people and they would be good parents. So there you have that story.
Wow. Yeah, so I can see the skeptics in this area saying, why is it that so few people have these kind of past life regressions and others don't? How do you kind of address that?
Well, the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies has been studying this phenomenon of children having past life memories since 1960. I think it was the guy who invented the Xerox machine or something. I think, that's what it was, who was interested in Buddhism and gave the University of Virginia a big endowment to study this issue of reincarnation. So they've been studying that for, 60 years, almost, just about 60 years. And during that time, they have accumulated over 2,500 cases that seem to check out, where the child's memory and someone that he remembered being seemed to be for real. And so having that many, they're able to actually look at the commonalities and make some statistical printouts on what's going on there. And the fact of the matter is that children who remember past lives, in the large number of the highest percentage of them, I've forgotten the exact percentage, but over 50%, something like 70%, died an unnatural, untimely death. So they didn't complete their life. Like James Henninger, that I told you about, the fighter pilot, died an unnatural death. He was 20 years old or something when he was killed in action. And so that seems to be a common thing. Many were murdered, others killed in wars. There are a number of Burmese children who remembered being Japanese soldiers in World War II in the research that the University of Virginia has done. And so they tend to have died an unnatural death without living a full life. And the other thing is that most of them, the average length of time between death and rebirth in this sample of 2,500 is something like 14 months. Now, there are outliers. There are outliers like James Henninger, who was killed in World War II in 1945 at the Battle of Iwo Jima and wasn't reborn until 1999 or year 2000. So there are outliers like that. But most of them come back pretty quickly. And I believe that the reason they tend to remember is because their life was cut short. They're coming back quickly, and they don't really spend a whole lot of time in the afterlife world, in the non-physical realm, or what we would call heaven, I guess, heaven or hell or whatever it is. And so they don't forget, as most of us do. In the Rosicrucian teachings about reincarnation, I probably shouldn't be sharing this, but I will, because I haven't been a Rosicrucian for a while, at least not an active one for a long time. The theory there is that the life between life is something like 140 years. So if you live 70 years, you're going to be on the other side for 70 years on average. And, during that time you would forget. So that, and there are past life regressions that are done, though, of people who, done by psychiatrists or hypnotists, therapists, who can take people back and remember past lives, even though they didn't in their normal waking state, because I don't know if I talk about it in this particular book, that there was a study done by, psychiatrists who are trying to figure out what's wrong with people, and they take them back to childhood, where you lock in the closet, when did this problem first begin? They ask them that question, and they'll go back to, a life that took place 3,000 years ago. That's happened in some occasions, that sort of thing. So anyway, that's my theory, that it's because their life was cut short, they come back quickly, and they still remember.
That's fascinating, and I do remember hearing another story where a young girl had experienced a previous life in the early 1900s. She was reportedly involved in when the big San Francisco fires happened, and was able to recall a lot of details at a very young age about what occurred during that event. And, just like the case you mentioned of the young boy who recalled being a fighter pilot, recalled a lot of details that checked out as they went back and researched it. Now, it's fascinating.
And there are also cases in the University of Virginia studies where children had birthmarks that coincide with the injury that killed them. For example, there was a man who was murdered. He was shot in the forehead. And when he came back, he had around a birthmark on his forehead, on the back of his head. The exit wound was a big splat, kind of, how the exit wound of a bullet would be. That was a birthmark. And there were others like that. There were people who were born who were... one case was someone who had their leg severed or cut off by a train, a railroad train, and came back, was born without that leg. And there are a whole bunch of them like that in the studies done by the University of Virginia, where there's some physical thing that relates to the cause of their previous life's death.
Fascinating. Yeah, so what we're going to go ahead and do now is we're going to take a short break, and we'll go ahead and be right back here in just a few minutes. Hey everybody, Curry here. I really hope you enjoy tuning in to the Passion for the Paranormal podcast, but did you know that you can actually get paid just for listening to this podcast? I know it sounds insane, but it's true. I just discovered this free new app called Podcoin, and it literally pays you to listen to podcasts. Here's how this works. You listen to podcasts and you earn Podcoin while you listen. And then you turn that Podcoin in for gift cards at, say, places like Starbucks or Amazon. And if you're a good enough person, you can even donate that Podcoin to charity. So the more you listen, the more you earn. So here's what I want you to do. Download the app right now on your iPhone or Android device, and I have a special code for you. Simply use the code PARANORMAL and you'll get 300 Podcoin just for signing up. And if you listen to enough of us on there, you can get a cappuccino or at Starbucks or an Amazon gift card on us. So go ahead and go listen to this podcast or virtually any podcast on Podcoin and sign up with the code PARANORMAL. All right, so I'm back with Stephen Hawley Martin. We're talking about his book, The Afterlife, The Whole Truth. And we were just talking about past life regressions and some case studies that he's covered in the book, some real fascinating ones. And I guess my question is, Stephen, from all I've heard about the afterlife and the fact that, we seem to no longer experience, pain like we do here in this life, what would make a person, a soul, want to reincarnate and, come back to this world knowing what we have to face?
I think that's an excellent question because my feeling is I'm not sure I want to come back again. But I think the reason is that it's to learn. I think when you're apparently on the other side, when you're in this non-physical realm, it's a dreamlike world, and whatever you think about or dream about or conjure up in your mind becomes real. And we come here to learn. Well, one of the things Edgar Casey said we come here to learn is patience, where you have to work at things. If you want to create something, you can't just think about it and suddenly create it. You have to work at it somehow, and you also have certain flaws. It's sort of like, if you know the concept of karma, the idea that that you attract to yourself situations and people that allow you to act out your karma and so forth, and you want to get over that. You can't do that on the other side. You have to come here and experience those same kinds of things again and again until you get it right. And what it brings to mind is, if you've ever seen the movie Groundhog Day, Bill Murray is this kind of cynical character who, when the movie begins, he's like, has all these things happen to him, and he reacts to them in a kind of cynical way, where he just puts people down and is kind of rude and a nasty kind of guy. And as the movie goes on, he goes to bed at night and he wakes up the next morning, and it's Groundhog Day all over again.
Right.
He has those same experiences, and one after the other, and it becomes very predictable what's going to happen, and eventually that goes on, and every day is Groundhog Day, and every day is Groundhog Day, until he finally gets it right and reacts to these situations in a compassionate, loving way, rather than as a cynic, which he started out being. And when that happens and he gets it right through the whole day, then he is able, when he wakes up the next morning, he gets the girl too, which is a big part of it, because she didn't like him when he was the cynic, but when he became the good guy, she decided she did like him. And so when he wakes up the day following that time, it's February 3rd, and he can move on. Well, I think that's kind of like what we're doing on a much slowed down basis. We're coming back until we can get it right, and until our souls evolve to a higher level, and we learn the lessons that we need to learn, and we become compassionate people.
I love that movie. I love the movie Groundhog Day. Love Bill Murray. But as you started relaying that story, the first scene that came to mind is when he wakes up in the morning, he starts smashing the alarm clock. But great movie. Love Bill Murray.
Yeah.
But no, that's that certainly makes sense. How you kind of use that as an analogy to soul progression. Do you think that some of us learn a lot faster in this plane of existence and do not reincarnate near as much as other souls?
I would think so. I mean, it makes sense to me that some people kind of get stuck, and they just keep making the same mistakes over and over again. I think it was Einstein who said something like the height of idiocy is to keep doing the same thing and expecting different results. But some of us are like that, and others seem to learn faster. And one of the things I keep telling my kids and so forth is learn from the mistakes other people make. You don't have time to make them all yourself. See what works and do it and go with that. But yeah, I think some people probably it's going to take them more incarnations than others to get there. There's a I don't know if I agree with it, but there's this thing called the Michael cosmology, and the Michael cosmology kind of follows what I said about reincarnating until you get it right. And the theory of that whole system that people have worked out is that there's something like 5 stages of soul or 7 stages of soul, and you have to go through each one, and it works out that probably something like 35 incarnations are needed to work through the whole thing. And who knows if that's true? I don't think it's that set, but it could be something like that.
Interesting. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about is this idea, and you mentioned disincarnate spirits or beings in the book. Now, is that basically just another way of saying ghosts?
The disincarnates?
Yes.
I think that has to do, there are some, apparently, not everybody, and of course this also has to do with culture, but if, for example, well, let me just say this. There are some people who die and either don't know they're dead or they don't know that they can move on to go to the light and go to this other realm. And they hang around in this, what's called the astral plane, which is just very close to the one that's right next to our physical plane. And there, what you would call poltergeists or haunted castles and things like that have these discarnates there who are like shadows that are just doing the same thing over and over again. And some of these folks are not very nice, and they try to latch on to people, and that's where you get things like possession and obsession and so forth. The real problems with evil spirits that are trying to take over your physical body because they want to get their kicks that way. I mean, I don't think that it happens very often, but you got to wonder about. There's definitely cases where people have been possessed, and where the Catholic Church still does exorcisms. There are also psychiatrists who work with people that have those kinds of obsessions. And I've interviewed a lady psychiatrist who's in Wheeling, West Virginia, and that's her specialty. She works with people who have spirit attachments to them. So that is, I guess, where that word discarnate comes from. It's somebody who's not incarnated at the present time.
Right, and so it brings up a good question. So I've been involved in paranormal investigating for many years, and we don't get a lot of answers in the field, other than strange things happen. You may be familiar with the term EVPs, and we've captured many of those over the years of doing this, but we very seldom get those far-reaching questions, and we ask them sometimes. Why are you here still? We very seldom get names. We don't get a lot of answers, but is it likely that, when we do have interaction, which we have from time to time, it's not like watching the crazy shows where, things are happening all the time, that sort of thing. But is it likely we're interacting with beings in this realm as paranormal investigators?
Yeah, I think so. And then, there could be fragments too. I really don't know that much about it, but I do know that the psychiatrists that I talk to very much believe that there are people who were alive and no longer alive who are still hanging around. And, it could be your great uncle, and he could invade your body, and not necessarily the full possession, but an obsession, where he likes alcohol, and he wants to lead you to the alcohol so he can get that kick. But as far as the hauntings and haunting houses, I can tell you a good story. This is one that happened to me. I told you earlier in the show that my first wife was French, and she had a good friend she went to school with who married a count. And this count, a French count, had a castle in the province of Lorraine, that's up near Germany. And they would, he'd made some money in the stock market and so forth, and he inherited this castle and fixed it up. It was in disrepair when he inherited, but, you know, he got construction workers there working on it and so forth, and putting new roof on and knocking down walls and stuff. And so my wife and I went to visit. His name was Henri, and his wife, Catherine, and we stayed in the castle. And while I was there, Henri told me that when they were doing the construction, he and his wife would go to bed at night, and he would lie there just before he fell asleep. He would hear someone screaming, like screaming for help. And it was very real, but, you know, it was in his mind, kind of. And it would happen every night. And so finally he went looking for where these night screams, these night noises were coming from. And he went down. There was kind of a basement, a wine cellar kind of place in this castle. It wasn't a 12th century castle. It was more like built in a big house built in maybe the 17th or 18th century. And chateau. And but he went down in the basement looking for this thing, and he noticed that there was a wall that looked newer than the others. So he got some of the workmen down there and had them pull down this wall. They pulled down the wall, and lo and behold, behind the wall was a skeleton. And they took the skeleton out. They gave it a Christian burial, and they never had noises at night again. And he believes, and I believe, that what happened was somebody bopped this guy in the head, put him back behind this wall, bricked it up, and he came to back there and was trying to get out. And he was screaming. But, of course, he died, but he didn't know that he had died. He didn't know he could just pass right through the bricks once he was just a spirit. And so he was there for 100 years, or however long it took, until they pulled down that wall and released him.
Yeah, and
so there you have it.
Yeah, that's that's almost kind of on the level of being, you know, creepy, although very interesting. But it brings up another question, and is it that once you get on that side, and I've heard this before a number of times, but is it kind of that time stands still, or there's really no concept of time on the other side?
There is no time. You know, when it says in the Bible, the end of time is when you die. Because time only exists in this dimension. The time is one of our dimensions. You know, we have up, down, you know, depth and time. And according to physics, you ought to be able to go backwards and forwards in time, because it's really all one thing. It's sort of like, the way I picture it is, time is like a river. When you're standing in it, it's passing by you, you know, the river current. You're standing there and it's going by. If you go way up in the sky, if you're an eagle, and you look down from 10,000 feet, you see the whole river, and the whole river is time, and it doesn't look like it's moving because you're seeing it all at once. And it's hard for our minds to wrap around it because we're so used to time, but time just doesn't exist. Another example of that is a story where, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Monroe Institute. It's here in Virginia, up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, where Bob Monroe, who was a radio guy, found he had out-of-body experiences, and he founded this institute where they study all that. And he's got this sound stuff in these rooms that you go to, and where you can go and have an out-of-body experience at the Monroe Institute. And he said apparently they're able to go to the other side and see things, and every once in a while they'll come across somebody like that who's stuck. And one case was the sailor who was on a ship, in the Irish Sea, the sea between England and Ireland. And in a storm, the ship went down, and he grabbed onto a piece of the ship, a board or something, and was hanging onto it. And that ship went down. They did some research. The ship went down in something like 1830. Well, that guy was still thought he was in that situation, holding on to that piece of wood in 1995, or whenever it was that they discovered him, and they were able to explain to him that he was dead and get him off of that and back going toward the light. So, it's like he didn't feel like he'd been there for 150 years because there is no time over there.
Right. And I think of, I've been to the Gettysburg battlefield several years back, but I think of that. I had Mark Nesbitt on the show, and he's written the Ghost of Gettysburg book series. And, a lot of stories of, people seeing apparitions of Confederate or Union soldiers and that sort of thing. But I think about those poor young men that, brave, but yet tragic situation where in that battle, thousands and thousands of Union and Confederate soldiers lost their lives. And, some of them were young. On the Confederate side, I think some were not even 18 years old. And suddenly their life's taken from them. And, it kind of harkens back to these cases you're talking about, because, many people have seen apparitions, while they're visiting there. I'm not saying that I had, but there's been a lot of strange experiences. Mark's written a lot of stories about them. But I kind of think of that story, and it makes you wonder, because I've often wondered this, why would they stick around for so long? But it's fascinating, this concept that they kind of have no concept of time on the other side, and that makes it, I guess, makes sense a little bit more from that perspective.
Yeah, and the Confederate soldiers thing, I live in Richmond, Virginia, and we have several battlefields around here, and the same, I've talked to people who tell me they have seen these soldiers. There was one house that was used as a hospital that's still standing, where a friend of mine swears that she saw a Confederate soldier standing on the stairs, of that house when she went in there, and then she turned around and was gone. But that sort of thing. They just don't know they're dead. It's apparently happened. Yeah,
it's kind of a sad thing to think about, that there are these if you want to call them ghosts or spirits, kind of lingering, and but then you wonder, why are some people so quick to go into the light and move on to the other realm, while these others kind of linger and just hang around for such. Well, again, from our perspective.
I agree, and I think one of the reasons I'm writing these books, and I think that your show is so important, and this show is so important, so that people will know when they pass that they need to look for the light and go to it. Because if they don't know it's there, and they don't look for it, they could be stuck just like those soldiers.
But I guess the reassuring thing is there's people that can help them, whether they be mediums. I think you mentioned, and I probably will not say the name right, Beischel. You mentioned in the book, maybe perhaps people like her and others in that work can help these spirits move on.
Yeah, in fact, the Monroe Institute, which I mentioned just a minute ago with the sailor in the Irish Sea, has a unit of volunteers that when there's a big tragedy like 9/11 or mass shooting like we had in Virginia Beach or something like that, that they will go out of body and go to those places and help the ones that are stuck, that don't know they're dead or haven't figured out what to do about it, and shoot them off to the light. So they call it something like it's mentioned in my book, the lifeline something. I've forgotten the exact name, but yeah, and they apparently are very active when those things happen, and it makes a difference.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the most fascinating topics or subjects when it comes to talking about being here or on the other side is the subject of near-death experiences. Now, I had another guest on the show had experienced a horrible tragedy, lost his wife and his 8-month-old son in an accident. I would say his experience was probably more because I don't know that he was ever pronounced dead. I think he was very clinging to life, but so his may have been a little bit more in the out-of-body realm. But, some of the researchers, you already mentioned Raymond Moody, Jeffrey Long, Dr. Jeffrey Long, who's done many, many years of research on this subject. It's one of the most fascinating to me. I think there's a lot of similarities and counts from what I've read about it. But from your perspective and in your research, what do you find is the most compelling thing about the near-death experience phenomenon?
Well, the thing that says to me that they're real is that people are able to, when they first leave their body, able to tell what's going on around in the room. Like if they're on an operating table, what the doctors are doing and what they're saying to one another, and they're able to recount that when they come back. They can say so and so said such and such, and he did such and such. There's a story that I tell in the book about Pam Reynolds, who left her body. She had 2 aneurysms in her brain, and they weren't inoperable. But they were going to kill her if they left them there. So what they did is perform an operation on her where they actually drained the blood from her body through her thigh, through the artery down there in her thigh. She was a corpse. There was no blood in her body. She was dead as you can be. And she popped out of her head, and she saw instruments the doctor was using that looked like a drill. And she talked about that later. She heard the nurse down at the end of the table say, "I've got a problem here. I can't, kid does so-and-so," and the doctor tells her to do something else instead. And she recounted all that when she got back. But she did go on into the light. She met with a grandmother who'd gone before, with an uncle who'd gone before. She spent quite a time. I don't know how long she was under, a couple of hours, I think. It was a long operation. They had to drain the blood from her so that they could go in without damaging the brain and fix those aneurysms. There were 2 of them. And so those kind of stories are what make it so real. I mean, even I've seen an interview of her and her doctor, and how he said, yeah, she said, she knew what was going on, and she recounted exactly right. The other things that are fascinating about them is, the thing that I find that I think about often is the past life review. Some people are on the other side long enough to have that past life review where they see everything, and they describe it like a panorama of everything that happened in their life, and not only how they felt about it, but how others that were involved, that they were interacting with, reacted to it and felt about it. And that's changed how I interact with people, because, if you're not a nice person and you do things that are going to hurt others, then when you have that life review, you're going to feel what they felt when you did whatever it was. So that to me is a big part of the past life review, is a big part of the near-death experience that stands out for me.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and that does seem to be a common theme that I've read about too, is the life review. And I know this is kind of a controversial question, but I think it's an important one. And the question is, and I think you delve into it a little bit in the book, is it possible that also that people may be afraid of going into this light and traveling on because they have a fear of judgment? And perhaps maybe this is because they had some sort of Christian background that said, you either do this, you accept, this, or you have no chance of being redeemed. You have no chance of an afterlife. You're going to somewhere else bad. And from what I've heard and studied about this, it doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be that there really is no judgment for the most part. You go into a place of abundant love and that sort of thing. But I'm just wondering if you can address that. And because there's a lot of people, I think, that have fear of that, and what kind of judgment may be coming to them on the other end.
Yeah, that's a very important question, and certainly I think you're on the right track there. My understanding, and again, I've talked to a lot of people and I've done a lot of studying on this, is that there is no judgment by anyone else. If there's any judgment, it's your judgment of yourself. If you have this past life review, you see what you did and what your actions were and what the effect of your actions were. But the other beings that are around you at that time are really there to help you through it and to console you and to give you love so that you are able to learn from what that life was all about and what you did. And so no one judges you. And as I said, if anybody judges you, it's yourself judging yourself, not someone else judging you. And you're not punished for your actions. So that it's really that life, and this goes back to the theme we've talked about, is life is a learning experience. We're here at Earth University to learn. And when we pass over, we're going to see what we did and we're going to learn from it. If we didn't learn it here, we ought to learn it then. And so there's I no longer have a fear of dying. I don't want to be there when it happens.
Right.
But I'm not afraid of it any longer. I mean, and I've done some things I'm not happy about that I wish I hadn't. But I know that nobody's going to judge me for it except myself.
Right, and that's such a fascinating thought, is that maybe our problems would be so much less in this world if we all just accepted that we are eternal, and that once we move on, we're going to have another chance, even if we did a lot of things that we feel were bad in this life. We're going to have a chance to move on and learn from it, and this is not it, and this is not where it ends. And I think we all would maybe we'd all have a lot less stress in our lives if we come to accept that.
I think that's absolutely true. It certainly is true for me, and personally, I certainly have a lot less stress in my life. I'm not worried about dying, and it's learning what I've learned from all this study has made me a better person. And I don't judge others. That's one of the things I stopped doing a while ago. Everybody's got their reasons for doing whatever they're doing and their own issues, and it's not for me to judge them. And I think if we all took that attitude and we were just nice to each other and loving to each other and, followed the golden rule that do unto others as you would have others do unto you, then it would be a much, much better world.
Right. And the other concept that I wanted to talk about, and you touch on it in the book as well, is remote viewing. And I think there's kind of some crossover, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's a little bit of crossover between this and the out-of-body experience. I find it intriguing. You gave a couple of real-world examples where remote viewers have actually, and it's really been in the realm of, I think, some have been like Department of Defense, where remote viewers have helped locate Saddam Hussein, who was hiding in a hole. And, they were able to locate just about all of them were able to pretty closely in about the same location identify where he was hiding, and then the Skylab example as well. But what exactly, from your perspective and your research, is remote viewing, and can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, remote viewing is it's an ability that apparently all of us have, but 99.9% of us have never developed it, where you're able to see in your mind something at a distant location, often at a different time. I mean, again, because on the other side there is no time. In the case of the Saddam Hussein example that's in the book, that was done at a class taught by Stephen Schwartz at American University there at the Association of Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach, where I think he's had something like 18 people in this class that went on for a couple of weeks, and at the end of to teach them the remote viewing technique. Stephen uses it for archaeological research to see where things might be hidden, and so they can dig in the right places and so forth. But what they were able to do, he had them go into their remote viewing mode to find Saddam Hussein in 2003 or whenever it was, and they were to write that down, and he took all those answers and they were put in the safe, and then when Saddam Hussein was found, they took the information out of the safe, and it was all there. He was in the city or near the city that they said he would be. He was in a hole in the ground. He had $750,000 with him in cash. He had a revolver with him. All this stuff that they saw in this remote viewing was there. And the one about Skylab was actually 3 remote. The United States Army had a remote viewing unit to spy on the East Bloc nations and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And Skip Atwell was in charge of that, and I interviewed him a couple of times on my show that I had back in the 2007-2009 year. And one of the things his unit did was locate the people and give all the information needed for the captives in Iran that were held during the Jimmy Carter, the end of his presidency, and when Reagan first came into office. They were holding something like 444 captives there in the embassy in Tehran, and they had all of that mapped out. And that's what those helicopters that were sent there to rescue them were using. It's the information to rescue those people, but the helicopters never made it because of the rain of a sandstorm. But the one about Skylab, they used 3 remote viewers who were very good at it. I think it was Joe Monaco, Ian Swan, and another person whose name I don't recall right now, to predict where Skylab would come down. Skylab was launched back in the early 70s. It was like a 100-ton hunk of metal up there in the sky circling the Earth, and they knew it was going to come down. It was starting to come down, and so I think it was in 1979, so 40 years ago, they needed to know where it would come down, because if it came down on New York or Los Angeles or or Hong Kong, it was going to be a big mess. So, and those three people each did the remote viewing, and they all came up with an answer that was within a couple of miles of each other, and it came down in the outback of Australia, thank goodness, where it didn't do any damage to any humans anyway. How it's done, I don't know. I wish I could do it, but well, all I know is what Stephen Schwartz, and I interviewed him on my show, told me about it, as well as Skip Atwater, whom I interviewed twice about remote viewing.
Yeah, and I've heard of other people, and some of them have worked in Department of Defense that have been on shows coast to coast and other types of shows have talked about this. Seems to be, a real thing, and it just begs the question: why don't they, people like this? Why are they not helping solve, murder cases and stuff like that? It seems like these skills can be employed in so many different areas, especially like in homicide investigations and that sort of thing. But I guess there's very few to go around.
Well, absolutely, and I think one of the issues here, and one of the reasons that I write these books, is that we have a paradigm that people have bought into that is false, and that is that the physical world is all there is, and your brain makes your consciousness, and it doesn't leave. It's inside your head and nowhere else, and that's not true. But that's what the majority of people believe, and certainly the scientific community still sticks to that. It's like a religion for them. And if they would start investigating some of these things more, there are some people investigating it, but if the scientific community as a whole would say, okay, you got something there, let's really look into it, they would find out a whole lot of stuff that could be very, very helpful.
Yeah, and that brings me to my last question here, and you covered as one of the last chapters in the first book, and that is the idea that people may have a hard time accepting the truth that, the concept of an afterlife and consciousness outside the brain. Why is it so difficult for people to accept this, do you think?
Well, I think it's because they were brought up like I was, by teachers and parents that believe that the material world is all there is, that we're like animated meat. We're like robots with a computer-like brain that are walking around completely independent of everything else, and that when our brain clicks off, when the plug is pulled and the brain stops working, we're dead, and that's it. And that is not the way it is. There really is one life, and we're all part of it. There's this one giant consciousness, and we're each little individual cells within that have our own unique point of view in consciousness. But we're all connected. We're all connected through this consciousness that permeates everything. And that was what people believed 2,000 years ago or more. The American Indians. You look at any society that from early history had that view of the world being one, and that consciousness was everywhere, and each living thing was a manifestation of that consciousness, and we were each manifestations of it, and we go into it and we come back from it, and life is a big circle, life, death, rebirth, life, death, and rebirth. And that really is the way it is. But somewhere along the line, back in the 17th, 18th century, I guess, in the Age of Enlightenment, all that stuff was chucked aside, and people are sticking to the materialistic view. The scientists, a lot of them, like it's a religion. And if you try to argue with them about it, they're going to just say, no, it can't be. We don't believe that. They won't tell you how, why. You can give them a lot of evidence to say, oh, it's some sort of an anomaly. Well, that's going to change eventually, because it's, the water's building up behind the dam, and it's going to break. and it's going to break pretty soon, I think.
Yeah, and that's I'm glad you mentioned that. I just ran a Facebook poll on the Passion for the Paranormal Facebook page, and the question was, do you believe that the world is starting to experience a spiritual awakening? And I won't tell you what the results are yet. I'm curious to get what your take is on it. Do you think that's starting to happen today?
I think it is. More and more, and I think absolutely there's just too much evidence, and people, I think it's like I said, it's like a water building up behind a dam, and I think that we're passing from from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. If you want to look at it from I'm not much into astrology, but the astrologists would say that that's what will happen when you go from Pisces to Aquarius, is an awakening, a spiritual awakening, and that's happening. And we're right in the middle of that change.
Yeah, that's interesting. Again, this is not a professional poll. It's not representative. It was a pretty small sampling of people who voted, but it did come out just about 50-50. I think it came out about 54% voted yes, they think the world is experiencing a spiritual awakening, and almost the other half, I think it was about 46% said no. So that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe I'm hopeful. I'm in the stage where I think it's slowly starting to happen. There seems to be a lot of other people that don't think it is, but maybe it's just because of the fact that what you talked about there and what we just talked about at the end about there's still a lot of people holding on to these old concepts and the scientific notions that consciousness stays in the brain. So,
and I think that one of the reasons they hold on to it is because they don't want, like you said, they're afraid of dying, and they think that it's nothing. When they die, that's the end, and everything's black, then they don't have anything to worry about. The fact of the matter is they don't really have anything to worry about, even though they're going to continue on. So they need to understand that and get over it.
Right. And, hey, Stephen, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the show. I really, really enjoyed the book. I love how you've tied in all these concepts because, there's a lot of these different concepts. I've had different guests on the show that maybe cover one or two of them. You've kind of covered research on a whole bunch of them here, and that's what I really loved about the book. Where can people find your books and the work you do?
Well, there are a couple places. Of course, they can find it on Amazon. The name of the book is Afterlife, The Whole Truth, or you can get just the first volume, which is Life After Death, Powerful Evidence You Will Never Die. Or they can come to my website, shmartin.com, shmartin.com, StephenHawleyMartin.com. shmartin.com, and there'll be links there to the books. You can just click on the menu where it says books, and you'll see them all spread out there, and then pick the one you want, and it'll take you to the page on Amazon where that's sold. And then most of my books are available both in Kindle ebook form and in trade paperback form. So whichever way you prefer to read a book, you can choose that.
And do you have any more books along this line in the works?
Well, I do. I mean, I have other books that are similar. I've got a book on magic. I've got a book on what I call the Holy Grail, the real Holy Grail. I've got a book called The Truth About Life, which really gets into a lot of these different things that we've been talking about tonight. So, yeah, there are other books. Come to my website, shmartin.com, and you'll see them all there.
Great. Again, Stephen, thank you so much for joining me on the show tonight. It's been a pleasure talking with you. And any more books coming out down the road?
Probably, but I'm not working on any right now. I'm actually doing a ghostwriting project for somebody, so I'm tied up with that. And when that's done, then I'll turn back and maybe do another one.
Great. Well, hey, once again, Stephen, thank you so much for joining me on the show. And we hope everybody, the listeners, really enjoyed tonight's show. I think it was a great discussion. And hey, Stephen, have a great night.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed it too. It's been fun.
Okay, so that about do it for tonight's show, and a big thanks to Stephen Hawley Martin for joining me on the show. I really loved that discussion and how he kind of interweaved all these different concepts together that he talks about in the book Afterlife, the whole truth. And make sure you join me next episode when I'll have Nomar Slevik returning to the show. He was on the show back in November, and he's going to be talking to me about his new documentary, Otherworldly Amor. And Nomar's also written a couple of books on UFO sightings and abductions in Maine and the northeastern U.S. So it's going to be great to have him back on the show and to talk with him. And once again, thank you so much for tuning into the show, and have a great night.